Hey guys, welcome to another review of Yu-Gi-Oh! It's been a while since I've done one of these reviews, and for those of you who don't know, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's several of you who don't, this is a review series that has kind of been a little more on again, off again than I would really like it to be, where I slip into a more casual format than my typical review and talk about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Manga. Right now we're still in the initial 7-volume run of the manga, but eventually I do plan to cover every single aspect of the manga featuring the original cast. That includes Duelist, Yu-Gi-Oh! R, and the Yu-Gi-Oh! Millennium World arc that rounded out the series. I actually had to think very carefully about how I wanted to handle this next several chapters, as we have reached the point in the continuity where we are introduced to a character named Shoddy, who, while he doesn't pop up very often, is important enough that he was actually featured in the most recent Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie, after all of these years. And you could say I have mixed feelings about Shoddy as a character, which is why I've had trouble building up to actually doing this review. And not only that, but this is one of the chapters where the story tries to form an overarching continuity. And at the time, that was great, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Didn't have much of a story yet. It was very episodic, it didn't have an arc. But looking back on this from later on, it's pretty clear that a lot of the stuff here was heavily retconned later. So I've decided I'm going to split this up into at least 2, maybe 3 reviews. The first of which will cover the 2-part introduction to Shoddy as a character, as limited as that introduction might be, titled The Man from Egypt, Parts 1 and 2. A pharaoh's tomb has been unearthed in Egypt, and 2 months later the artifacts have been brought to Domino City, where Yugi lives, and put on display in the local museum. One of the professors who discovered the tomb is an old friend of Yugi's grandfather, so they get to go see the exhibit pretty much automatically. It's a given that they're going to go. And Yugi, being someone who wears a literal Egyptian artifact around his neck everywhere he goes, is certainly into checking all this stuff out, and all his friends end up going with him. We meet Yugi's grandfather's friend. He is a really nice guy. He seems like a really fair guy, really cares about knowledge for knowledge's sake. He isn't grave robbing for profit, let's put it that way. And then we meet his partner, who is a selfish, money-grubbing asshole who would probably sell out small children if he had the opportunity. In fact, we find out pretty definitively later that he would. Just looking at these 2 character designs, can you tell me which of them is the bad guy? Yeah, Kazuki Takahashi is not subtle in the way he designs characters, man, which is something we'll talk about again in a second. Pig Nose here is very interested in Yugi's Millennium item, wants to put it on display with the rest of the Egyptian artifacts at the museum, and eventually convinces Yugi to part with it for 1 day. But it's revealed immediately through an internal monologue that he plans to sell it during that 1 day. Because have we mentioned, he's the bad guy. Yugi, Millennium Puzzleless, and his friends are taken on a tour of the exhibit by Yugi's grandfather's friend. His name is Professor Yoshimori. They talk a little bit about how Egyptian artifacts are handled now versus in the past. How you don't just get to keep what you found anymore. Those artifacts belong to Egypt and are only sometimes leased to other countries to be put on display. And I have to hand it to Kazuki Takahashi here. A lot of the artifacts that are on display in this fictional exhibit are very accurate. He clearly put a lot of research into these panels. And his clean, crisp line style of drawing does them a great service. Everything here looks pristine and beautiful. I particularly really like this panel of Anzu looking at some hieroglyphs of Anubis weighing someone's heart. For those who don't know, in Egyptian mythology, when a person dies, their sins are judged by Anubis. Their heart is weighed against a single feather, and if it outweighs the feather by too much, they are deemed unworthy of the afterlife and are devoured by the monster Ammit. I may be a little bit of an Egyptian mythology nerd, so I do really appreciate these chapters. A lot. However, as all of this is going on, Shoddy arrives in the country. Remember how I said that Kazuki Takahashi is not subtle when he's designing characters? Well, let's just say that Shoddy is another example of that. But again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Even though Shoddy is shown arriving kind of as the group is heading into the museum, he's somehow there by the time they get to the display of the pharaoh's mummy. And this is actually where Yugi meets him. Shoddy is gazing at the pharaoh's mummy and shedding tears. And a fun fact that I don't know if a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Fans realize, but this is actually the pharaoh. Later on, we find out that the other Yugi is, let's say, connected to an ancient pharaoh, because I don't want to spoil the exact nature of who or what he is yet. He is in some way connected to an ancient pharaoh. This is that pharaoh. And even though not everything here is entirely accurate to what we learn later on, looking back on this chapter after having read everything, after having experienced the end of this story, it's pretty cool. Shoddy and Yugi interact for a little while. Shoddy recognizes that Yugi is a good person, and then he walks off. Yugi making note that he's holding a set of scales, very reminiscent of the scales that we saw in the hieroglyphs from earlier. And in case you missed it, he had a feather tucked into his turban. We get a couple brief panels of the gang looking at Yugi's Millennium Puzzle on display, which they think is pretty neat. But the real point of focus here is this panel of Mr. Pignose talking to his buyer. He is scheming to sell the item with Yugi standing right there, and yet Yugi is none the wiser. Thankfully, after Yugi and company leave the museum, Shoddy moves to confront Mr. Pigman. We see that he's already left one body in his wake, that being the buyer, and from there he proceeds to weigh Mr. Pignose's heart in a ceremony very similar to that heart-weighing ceremony that we saw in the hieroglyphs earlier, except that he calls it a shadow game. This is when it's supposed to become absolutely clear to the audience that Shoddy's scales are in fact a Millennium item, just like Yugi's Millennium Puzzle. He weighs Mr. Pignose's heart, and while Mr. Pignose does try to lie his way out of it, the scales can tell that he's lying. He is judged to be a bad person and fed to Amit. Like, the dude wasn't actually eaten, his soul was just devoured, and he was left dead because of it. But still, it's pretty harsh. Shoddy goes to leave, and this is when he notices the Millennium Puzzle and recognizes it for what it is, which is pretty interesting in and of itself. But meanwhile, it is also time for Yugi to come back into the museum and get the Millennium Puzzle back from Mr. Pignose. So he heads back inside and crosses paths once again with Shoddy. Yugi sees the Millennium Puzzle on his person, refers to it as his Millennium Puzzle, and so Shoddy now recognizes Yugi as the one who solved the puzzle. Shoddy, who had earlier identified himself as a Tomb Guardian from a long bloodline of Tomb Guardians, makes note that solving the Millennium Puzzle is said to give the person who solved it the same power as his bloodline, i.e. the Shadow Games. This is when it's revealed that an Ankh necklace that Shoddy has been wearing around his neck this entire time is another Millennium item, the Millennium Key. He's able to use it to open up Yugi's mind and make a pathway for himself to enter the room in Yugi's soul, which will tell him all about the kind of person that Yugi is. It is, in and of itself, a harmless process, but can be used to do harm. It's actually pretty interesting. We're going to see a little bit more of this power in action in the following few chapters. But keep in mind that he specifically says the room in Yugi's soul, explaining why he's so perplexed when he finds not one room, but two. One is open and bright and full of childish things, but the other is closed off and mysterious and bears the same symbol as the Millennium items, the same eye-like symbol. And even though there shouldn't be anybody but Shoddy in either of these rooms, the mysterious door opens and the other Yugi is there. He offers to allow Shoddy inside, but Shoddy will have to play a game. A shadow game, specifically. Shoddy enters, and he finds the room to be an M.C. Escher-esque labyrinthian maze. He's allowed to search it for whatever information he is trying to glean about the other Yugi, but he's unable to find anything because the entire room is so difficult to navigate and filled with traps, just like an Egyptian tomb would be. And the entire remainder of these two chapters are just a bunch of badass visuals of Shoddy getting lost in the other Yugi's soul room, and the other Yugi being generally badass. Eventually, Shoddy refuses to give up in his search and almost dies, only to be saved by the other Yugi, who seems to have deemed him to be a good person, just like Shoddy deemed Yugi to be a good person earlier on. The other Yugi makes like he might not save him at first, just to be a cheeky little bastard, but he does it. He saves him and then flat out tells him that he only really let him get so close to the brink of death because he doesn't like that Shoddy thinks he can just go into other people's minds and snoop around. He advises Shoddy to leave, and Shoddy does, but at the same time he acknowledges that this is only the beginning, that he intends to continue this in some form. He gives Yugi back the Millennium Puzzle and mentions Yugi's other self. This is the first time that Yugi's ever really had solid confirmation that the other Yugi exists. I mean, I'm sure he must have suspected it by now because he keeps blacking out and then his enemies mysteriously find themselves punished. But now he has a real reason to suspect it. These two chapters aren't by any means perfect, but they are a lot of fun. Going back and rereading them for this review only served to remind me of just how much fun they are. Shoddy shares some of the same design problems that Mr. Pignose did. There is absolutely nothing subtle about his design at all. And there is the problem that he is portrayed as a brown-skinned man in a turban who is on a holy crusade for his gods, which could be considered to be a little racially sensitive. In fact, the 4Kids dub basically dropped all pretenses and made Shoddy into a racist caricature of this character. Because, and I cannot stress this enough, 4Kids is literally the devil. It's also pretty morally ambiguous what Shoddy is doing. Yeah, those were bad people. Yeah, they violated the tombs of one of Egypt's ancient rulers, someone with a lot of historical significance. But did he really have the right to kill them? I don't think so. And unfortunately, this version of Shoddy never really gets a chance to develop in anything other than this because he is very heavily retconned later on. Here it's very heavily implied that he's a guardian of the tombs of any of the ancient pharaohs, judging those who would rob their tombs and take their artifacts. But later on we learn that that's not entirely true. He's a guardian of one very specific pharaoh's bloodline, and his specific duty is to watch over the Millennium items. That's why I'm at least 90% sure that the pharaoh here is supposed to be that pharaoh from later on in the story, but even that doesn't fit these chapters super well. And then there's the issue that, and I will go so far as to spoil this for you, the other Yugi is not Yugi. He's not some part of Yugi's personality that split off or was created by the solving of the Millennium Puzzle. He is a spirit who lives in the Millennium Puzzle. He resides there, and when Yugi wears the Millennium Puzzle, that allows the other Yugi to share his body. And yet we see here the other Yugi is present inside Yugi's mind, even when Shadi is in possession of the Millennium Puzzle. And it can't just be that the puzzle was close to Yugi, because we see later on very definitively that that's not enough. He has to be wearing it. So obviously Kazuki Takahashi hadn't quite settled on who the other Yugi was yet, or how the Millennium Puzzle worked. And all that's fine. Retcons are fine. I just wish they weren't quite so big, because while I do really enjoy these two chapters, it makes going back and reading them again almost as annoying as it is enjoyable, which is a bit of a problem. Not to mention that these two chapters are mostly just cool visuals and build up for the next few chapters, but there's nothing wrong with that either. It's just they aren't as interesting as the next few chapters. In fact, when I think The Man from Egypt, the title of these two chapters, I tend to think of not the visuals from these two chapters, but from the next three. I think it's 3 anyway. Yeah, 3. Because those visuals, those scenarios are just so much more memorable. But then I go back and read it and I relive that entire chapter of the other Yugi just messing with this guy. And I'm reminded of just how cool the other Yugi is, and I can't help but think that these chapters are better than I remember them to be. I'll talk more about Shadi as these chapters progress. I do want to say here, though, I don't think that Kazuki Takahashi meant anything racist in his design, which I feel needs to be said because I know there are people out here who interpret this design in a racist way. If he meant something racist by it, he wouldn't have developed Shadi so well in these coming chapters and then later on. Like I said before, Shadi doesn't pop up very often, but he is a very important character, and he does quite a lot. Overall, these two chapters were really solid as introductory chapters to a short arc of the story, and as an introduction to a new character who will round out to be very interesting by the time the story is over. As per usual, I'd like to know, what do you guys think of these chapters if you have read them? Let's get a discussion going in the comments section down below about the chapters themselves or about the character of Shadi. I'm willing to talk about either. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.